If this is your first Docker meetup, Docker Atlanta meetup. Okay, awesome. We only had one since the pandemic in person, and that was back in February. So we're going to work on, my name is Ari Waller, and I happen to be the local Docker organizer for the meetup. And we're going to work on getting one every other month. And we're really excited about that. We have a lot of other events at JFrog. So sometimes I think some of you have come to some of the other events that we have here as well. We have some DevOps oriented meetups too. So obviously we have a really great facility for this. And my job happens to be, a portion of it has to be meetups. So we definitely want to take advantage of that and obviously share with the community as much as possible. So welcome. We started a Docker Atlanta Meetup channel. YouTube channel. So if you have not subscribed yet, it's a small list right now, but go ahead and feel free to take your QR code and sign up. We are going to typically, unless there's a reason why not, post the videos. I've been asked by a few people, are we going to make these hybrid? And the answer is no. I believe that hybrid is the cannibal of the in-person meetup. And, I was definitely torn both ways. If there was a way, maybe one of you technologists and I can go into business. You ready for this? Do you know how local football games, they make the game unavailable to the locals unless it's sold out? Well, if we can create a program for Zoom to do that, it's probably something with IP addresses and stuff like that. I'd be happy to let people from other states join, but not the state of Georgia. So if there's a way to figure that out, let's talk offline. We'll make a lot of money. But other than that, we're going to continue to do it this way. So, but we will eventually, and I say eventually, I hope to get it up fairly shortly after meetups on the channel. We have 2 of our last videos up there right now for your enjoyment. Typically, so far, what we've tried to do, I'm going to try and do this at least for the rest of the year, is there's some amazing people out there that have earned the title of Docker Captain. And I want there to only be one person that logs in for these meetings, and that is the Docker Captain. And I want to do that consistently through the year. So this month, we are lucky to have Melissa McKay, who actually happens to be a JFrog employee, which is awesome, and does hold the title of Docker Captain. We had Docker Captain last time, and next month and in June, I am talking to the Docker Captain, Ajit Raina in India, who runs the Bangalore meetup. Very active in the community. You know Ajit? Very active in the Docker community. In fact, I think he helped put some of the standards in place for the captains at one point. And he's going to be sharing with us. A brilliant speaker, and looking forward to that as well for June. So that's the plan. Also, we want to hear from you. This is, we want to have both a Docker Captain and one of our local speakers. So tonight we have Ray that's going to be sharing with us, and we would like one of those speakers to be somebody in the community as well. Go to our call for speakers. You can always send me a note on LinkedIn too. It doesn't have to be formal, but do submit a topic, and we'll take it under, and then we'll get back to you. We'll definitely get back to you. But we want to hear from you, and you don't have to be an expert to speak. It's not like you have to be the grand poobah of a particular subject in Docker to do this. There's value to what you do every day. Obviously, Docker has enough components to it that you are probably an expert in something you don't even know you're an expert in, just based on what you do. So share with your colleagues, and it would be really, really valuable. Follow us on Twitter. Another small following, but we kicked it all off at once. Shameless plug for my amazing son, who's a graphic designer. He created the Docker Atlanta logo, and yes, I did get permission to use it by the community team there, because I didn't want to infringe on any copyright. So very proud of my son. If you ever need some graphic design work, ICK Designs. So I don't like to do a ton about JFrog. So for those of you who don't know, this is where I balance. I am the community programs manager for JFrog. So my job at JFrog is I handle global meetups for JFrog. The Docker is set aside from that. I deal with meetup organizers all across the globe, and it's not fair that I work with them and for a living, but I don't understand what it's like to be a meetup organizer. So during the pandemic, I was a meetup organizer for multiple meetups, including Go San Francisco and Go New York throughout the pandemic. But now that we're back in person, I really wanted to see the Docker meetup in Atlanta be revived again. So it's really important. So this is in essence, but I do get to wear the JFrog hat too, because JFrog is a host. and I get to help with the facility. So just a couple of words from our sponsor very quickly. Tonight, we are doing a raffle for a Google Nest. You may have already signed up for this. If you have, it's great. We will select a winner. At the end of the evening, you must be present to win. Okay. Now, we did have another contest with JFrog this month. Now, this one's a little bit different. This is a monthly contest, and this is a survey. So we have one of the most important things. JFrog was founded based on the community feedback loop, frankly. We were an open source product when we started in 2006, even before we were a company in 2008. And because that connection to the community is so important for us, we do have a survey, and we would love, if you are willing, of course, totally opt in. This is optional, of course, is to fill out the survey, and you will be entered into our monthly contest. In the first week of May, we're going to be doing a drawing for a Nintendo Switch. Winner will be contacted by email that week. Terms and conditions apply. They're there. You'll see them. Want to. But one of the things it also helps us do, just frankly, this is going to sound very PBS, but it allows JFrog to continue funding community programs like this. So it's helpful when they get that feedback. So contribute if you'd like to, and if not, just enjoy yourselves. It's no pressure for that tonight.
Go back to the Google Nest.
Yes, there's the Google Nest one if you want to get that one. Well, oh, JFrog employees can't win any of these. So if you're from JFrog, you can. So I have to work on getting the JetBrains IDEs for this meetup. The problem I've had, and I need your help this evening before we go into our first talk, is I've been getting JetBrains IDEs throughout the pandemic, and I have several from the last 3 months that I have not given out because I don't do the Go meetup anymore. If these, I'm going to make the appropriate connections, but I don't want these to go to waste. So I'm going to probably hand something out shortly that you can pass around. And some of you already typed it in, but basically I need, if you want to be entered into a contest for a IDE this evening, I have enough to give away. How many people would actually get the IDE and activate it tonight if they got it? Raise your hands. Okay. I would say that we probably have something for most of you then. So that's good. And if you don't have an IDE, I definitely have a couple of codes for some Docker swag. So way too much to give away tonight. Again, I don't want to spend too much time on the giveaways. Let's get to the talks. But I'll probably just at the end figure out ways to distribute those appropriately, okay? That being said, without any further ado, you there, Melissa?
I am here.
Yes.
You can hear me okay?
Yeah, we can. Let me go ahead and unplug from this. Oh, good. All right. Well, everyone, our first talk is going to be from Melissa McKay. I'm not going to do her justice with her introduction, but I will say one of them, and I mean this sincerely, and I do work with amazing people at JFrog, but I have an immense amount of respect and love working with Melissa. And she's got some really amazing insights and experience that I know she's going to share with us tonight. So everyone, JFrog Developer Advocate and Docker Captain, Melissa McKay. Let's welcome her from Denver.
Hey, everyone. I can't hear anyone anymore, so hopefully you can still hear me. Can you give me a thumbs up? All right, awesome. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and get started here. All right, you should be able to see my slides now. We are here for applying 12-factor principles to containerized applications. This is actually draft one of a talk that I'm continuing to build out. I've got some ideas for it. So I'd love to get your feedback after what more you would like to see. And especially if you have any questions that you want me to dive into deeper. I usually like to do more thought leadership talks. This one in particular is not so much into implementation details yet. It's more of the thought around it, the reasons why we do the things we do. But as I get more time to speak and use this talk, I'd love to expand it into workshops and get into the deep implementation details, because I'm sure that as we go through some of these factors, some of these principles, you're going to be wondering, well, okay, that sounds great, but how do I actually do that? So just a little bit of intro. I was there in Atlanta not too long ago. I really miss being there with you. So I'm glad to be able to be with you virtually, at least this time. Hopefully we'll run paths, again in the future next time I'm in Atlanta. But just a little bit about my background. I have been a developer advocate now for 3 years with JFrog. Prior to that, I was a developer by all means, all the way from intern to principal developer at my previous employer. During that time, I became a speaker. I got involved in helping to organize some unconference events. These are conferences that are less formal. They're more like groups of folks that are in a circle, very much a smaller audience. It's not so much one speaker up front talking and, teaching everyone. It's more of a group effort. The topics are chosen each day, depending on who arrives and who has the expertise. Very, very cool stuff. So during that time, while I was doing that, I quickly realized that being a speaker and being a full-time developer was pretty difficult. We all have obligations outside of our normal jobs. So I decided it was time for me to find a position where I could do this more full-time. So here I am with JFrog. During the last 3 years, I did become a Java champion. Java is my primary career language, but I've never met a Java developer that isn't into something else these days. We all have learned, a lot of other tips and tricks along the way, and a lot of other languages. Something I'm interested right now in is Rust. That'll be forthcoming. I did become a Docker champion or a Docker captain as well. Containers have always intrigued me, mainly because of the reasons why they came about, how they came about, how we use them now. So it's something that I continue to delve into, not just Docker, but all containers in general. Here's my LinkedIn and my Twitter handle. If you want to reach out to me, you can do that at any time, especially if you want to ask questions or just provide me some feedback. All right, so I've been working with containers for a while, and in my previous position as well, it was something that was brought to our team where we, needed to containerize an existing application. This was my first time in dealing with containers, actually. So when I first took a look at the Docker file, that was exciting for me to, walk through that and figure out exactly what's happening and how this is working. So pretty cool stuff. But something I always like to do is always go back to the original principles. For now, you can do so much with just a Docker file and all the commands that are available to you. You can do all kinds of things that are not good for you. You can do things that are good for you. So it's always a good idea to go back to the beginning, figure out what best practices are without learning too much from trial and error like I have in the past. Sometimes that can be fairly painful. I do have some stories I can share about that as we go here. So I went out and I went looking for the 12-factor app. This is something that's been out a long time. If you're not familiar with the 12 factors app, definitely go check it out. It is all available at 12factor.net. So take this link down and go there. Much of this talk is heavily based on that. There is a lot of, blogs and stuff out online about this as well, but I like to go to the source, read it, figure out how it's applicable to me, and then go forward from there. But basically, the 12-factor app was written by Adam Wiggins around 2011. He put it out online as an ebook. He was one of the founders of Heroku, and he was interested in how to release software reliably, how to scale it quickly, and how to maintain it in a consistent and predictable manner. All of this sounds like heaven to a developer like me. So obviously the 12 factors are something I'm interested in. This is just a snapshot of his website. This is what he has, adamwiggins.com. Clearly a passionate person, interested in making all of our lives easier. Someone cool dude to follow and check out if you're not familiar with Adam Wiggins. This slide just comes directly from the 12-factor app website. It talks a lot about the methodology. It's primarily focused on software as a service app. It talks about using declarative formats for setup automation. I know for one, as a developer, I cannot count how many times as a new developer on a new project, I was always assigned, fix the documentation for setting it up. And it never worked the first time. It was always a struggle. So you'd always reserve, maybe 2 or 3 days to ramp up on a project, make sure you have all of the dependencies that you need and make sure, the documentation is up to date. So this whole idea of focusing on automation around that is huge. Definitely works to minimize time and cost for new developers. It also talks about having a clean contract with underlying operating systems, and it talks about, portability between systems. I remember one time I was set up on a new project. I started to get everything building and all, and I started running through the tests just to make sure that I was a good point in the application development cycle, that I could start working on something new, right? This is a common thing. We do this all day, every day. So I started running the tests. I get to one group of tests and it fails immediately. And the reason it fails is because the last person that ran those tests was running on a Windows machine. And they had written a test that was specific to a Windows machine, things like file system stuff. And I just thought that was really silly. So this is something that pleases me to see, that we work more toward and focus on making sure that our stuff is compatible. Doesn't matter what OS you're running on. Obviously, this is my love coming from a Java background. So look forward to. We talk about suitability for deployment on modern cloud platforms. I love spending more of my time on the development side of things rather than on sysadmin work. So it's something that I like immediately. Minimizing the divergence between the different environments, like development and production, and enabling continuous deployment. I am currently sitting on the technical oversight committee for the CDF, the Continuous Delivery Foundation. This is something that's been really interesting to me. So we talk a lot about continuous delivery. We have a lot of special interest groups that come from this foundation. One of them is interoperability. I'm a chair of that group as well. These are all, groups of people that are interested in making this easier for everyone, for developers, for those on the operations side of things, any DevOps teams. This is all a goal of ours, to make continuous delivery the default way of doing things. Scaling up without significant changes to tooling, architecture, or development practices. It's lovely when you get your service all up and it works great. It passes all the tests and you deploy it, and then the load just kills it. This is something that obviously, if you're for-profit organization, is something that you want to address immediately. So being able to scale up, being able to offer your services without interruption to all of your customers, something that, we always want to improve. So all of this sounds good. And I'm just talking about 12 factors. I wasn't talking about containers, but this sounds very much like the goals of containerization, right? A lot of these goals are the same. It also goes hand in hand with, microservice methodology. A lot of these items here apply to microservices as well. Well, Docker introduced the world as open source. That happened in 2013. So, a couple years after this 12-factor app made its first appearance, its first draft out there, we did start talking about containers a whole lot more. Now, both Docker and containers in general are, household words, but it has taken us some time to get here. And a lot of that really was about getting more of the tools ironed out. There was a lot of work done in the industry around tooling to make that whole containerization process of SaaS apps more efficient and easier for developers to pick up and do right off the bat. And a huge part of that is due to the development of frameworks like Kubernetes, OpenShift, Docker Swarm, and some others out there. But now we're at a point where most people I know, if they haven't worked with containers, they certainly have heard of them. And certainly in this group here, you probably are all working with containers right now. So the real question here is, why do I have a picture of bananas on the screen? And this is just a silly thing for me. I have yet to find a more fun theme for containers than bananas. I absolutely refuse to use the shipping container metaphor. So hopefully you'll enjoy this, make this a little bit more entertaining for you. All right, so we're going to walk through these 12 factors, these 12 principles, and just see, how we feel about them, why they're there, what the idea is behind it, and maybe how it applies to containers. I'm by no means a banana expert, but just a little bit of research came up with this bit of trivia. Might be useful to you someday, who knows? But the commercial version of the banana that we see today is the Cavendish variety. And these plants, they actually are genetically identical clones. They do not grow from seeds. And because of the years of crossbreeding and stuff, any seeds that you might see when you bite into one of these bananas, they're just vestigial. If you actually go out and try to plant them, they're not going to grow into a banana plant, unfortunately. And this picture here is of a rhizome or a bulb that can be taken from one plant and then transplanted. And it will also eventually produce more bulbs, and then that process is repeated. And whether that's a good way to maintain our commercial supply of bananas, that's up for debate. But what does this have to do with this first principle? And I ask that you stretch your brain a little bit to really get the metaphor here. But the idea is that no matter how many deploys that you have, your app should come from a single source. The code base should be the same across all of the deploys, all through the different versions that may be in the deploy. And you may have different, maybe some commits that aren't yet into staging or into production, but they all come from the same code base. So you can, identify them as different deploys of your same app. And that is directly from the 12-factor information. An example of this not being the case, I always feel bad for picking on this particular project because I use it a lot for, especially in workshops or just to show as an example. It's actually a really good example, but there are some things in here that are intended specifically for demo purposes, not for production purposes. So although I pick on this, I'm counting on the fact that we all know this is not an application that's meant for production. It's here for us to play with and work with and learn how to do things. This is from a GitHub repo. It's called Spring Pet Clinic Cloud. It came originally from a microservices version of this Pet Clinic application. It's basically like just an application that you could use if you were a veterinarian, for example. It checks in, people's pets and records who the owner is and things like that. Anyway, there's lots of different services in here, but they're all actually different services that probably should be in their own repos. These are all in their own in directory, but all within the same repo. And in the 12 factors app, it explains that if this is actually would be a distributed system. And each of these components is an app, and each can individually follow the 12-factor methodologies. So this right here is actually a violation of 12-factor. If there's any code that's shared, that should also be put into a library, which can be included using a dependency manager of some sort. So yeah, having it all here in the same repo isn't exactly how things should be done. In this particular app, if you wanted to go check it out, each one of these services, when you build, it results in its own individual container here. All right, number 2. And I'm going to focus on this one pretty heavily because dependencies are my thing. And I certainly won't spend as much time on the rest of the factors, so don't be afraid. I know we spent a lot of time on just the first and second one here. But we don't talk about dependencies enough, so I'm going to spend a little bit more time here. Directly from the 12-factor app, a 12-factor app never relies on implicit existence of system-wide packages. This means you can't ever take for granted that if you run curl, that it's going to be there unless you explicitly put it there. So this is something that applies to a 12-factor app, but certainly applies to containers, right? And can actually make their life a little bit easier because it gives us an environment that forces us to make sure that everything we need is in there. It has gotten difficult because now we not only have the application that we're worried about as a developer, but now we have the packaging of the application and everything that's around the application. So we're talking about the OS tools, where OS packages, things that come in that are separate from the actual Java application or JavaScript application or whichever. So the 12-factor app really encourages developers to use Package Manager for their apps. And then we also need to just pay attention to where everything is coming from. And if we walk through the development process by itself, we start out with our developer. This developer chooses a language and framework. Let's say he's very wise and old and he chooses Java. And he's going to need a package manager. So this developer might choose Maven. And lists all of these dependencies in a POM file. Then when they build the project locally, this package manager assists by reaching out to a global central repository. In this case, it's going to be Maven Central, and pulls in everything that you need. The problem here is transitive dependencies. These are dependencies of dependencies. So even though I may have done the work of explicitly declaring the dependencies that I want in my application that I'm using directly, those dependencies may have dependencies of their own. So we need to pay attention to that, make sure that we have a good accounting of everything that our project relies on. Obviously, developers do not want to reinvent the wheel. This is an overused graphic, really, but this concept is real. Software is potentially made up of a ton of components that a developer may not have firsthand knowledge of. These applications and services that we have today are more complex than ever. And developers generally, we don't want to repeat, we don't want to rewrite stuff that's already out there. So we continuously bring stuff in. Unfortunately, this becomes even more difficult when we bring in build servers. They're meant to be tools to automate this process, make everything easier for us, but they behave the same way. Unless you configure it differently, you're going to have a build process that reaches out to Maven Central and then pulls all of your dependencies in. This is the time when you need to consider some kind of artifact management system. Shameless plug for Artifactory, really excellent at this. But whatever you use, it's got to be a better use than constantly reaching out to central repos. Now, you may have multiple steps in your build process. And one of these steps could be actually the job of packaging your application into a container. And once again, by default, you're going to be reaching out to Docker Hub, the central repo for a lot of containers, bringing stuff in to your build processes and using it. So at this point, you would really need to consider making sure that you have, some kind of caching mechanism or some kind of artifact and image management system where you can pull these in and store them without constantly reaching out to these external services for this. Even more complicated, all of these steps and jobs themselves be running in containers themselves. And these could be managed by, some kind of build platform out there where they've decided for you what container you're going to be building in. So all of these things you need to pay attention to when you're, considering how your project is built, really making sure that you're taking having a good accounting of everything that's involved in your process and making sure that you mitigate a lot of maybe third-party pain, especially when maybe one of these third-party services become unavailable for a limited amount of time, or maybe forever if something is deleted or moved that you need for your build. I like looking at real examples. This is a very, very derived Docker file here, but the interesting parts that I want to focus on are highlighted. We talked, about application dependencies and stuff. Now that we're packaging them in containers, we've got some other dependencies that we need to be concerned with. You can see that, there's some packages here that are being installed on this particular image that need to be available for our application for whatever reason. And the one on the left does not explicitly define the versions of these applications. That isn't horrible in and of itself. It's just that now you have a build that's pretty unreproducible. It's going to take some homework, to get in there and figure out what versions is actually being used. You can cause yourself some troubleshooting problem, especially the next time you need to rebuild this image, and all of a sudden it doesn't work. And it brought in a later version of a package than you had before. It's not even your app. It's something else in the system. So do yourself a favor and explicitly define the versions that you want to bring in of everything that you need. The one on the right, obviously put in some versions, but there's a couple of other questions you should be asking right away. That top line, we are starting with a base image. Sure, we're declaring a version, but where is this base image coming from? Do we have it stored? Do you know how that one is built? When it comes time to update it, are you going to be able to? These are things you need to know about your own project and how it's built. And then this line, obviously, like I said, this is derived. This isn't a real application, doesn't even have like a language, you can't even tell. But you would want to know if you're just copying an app, what version of the app is this? Where is it coming from? Is it just the latest version that was built? Is it the latest that has passed tests? Is it the latest that's passed integration tests so that it's, able to go into production without a worry? These are things you need to consider when you're writing your Docker file. All right, moving on. Like I said, we'll go through the rest of these much faster. So number 3 involves config. Lots of times, config could be stored, as constants. Basically, don't use environment variables. That's what the 12 factor, what that says is to use environment variables. There's lots of different ways to do this, but one thing that the principle says, and this is directly from the text, a litmus test for whether an app has all config correctly factored out of the code is whether the code base could be made open source at any moment without compromising any credentials. So now we have it. Now we have the why we need to worry about this. We don't want our credentials being stored in places they shouldn't. This is something I struggled a lot with a lot of Java applications, because we did have, this idea that we want to be able to run our application in different environments without having to rebuild the whole thing. And it first started out with Maven profiles. We were able to build, like a profile that was intended for development or a profile that was intended for production. But the problem with doing it that way is that in order to release, you had to rebuild. to release? Well, whenever you're involved in rebuilding your application, you kind of defeat the purpose of going through all of the testing of the original artifact. So that was never really a good way to do things. So I really appreciated when Spring came onto the scene and they had Spring profiles. These were profiles where you could actually just through an environment variable affect how the app would run, like which configuration it would use, things like that. So the things you want to include in your config are, any backing services like database credentials, things like that. Also, you need to be careful about how you inject variables like that into the Docker container, because passing those values directly via the command line is not very secure. You could accidentally put stuff like that into source control. And also when those containers run, when you pass them in that way, if you do an inspect on the container, if you have access to be able to do that, you can actually see the values. So potentially you could have, maybe you want to limit your developers from knowing, production passwords. That's not really a trust thing so much as a don't do something stupid by accident thing. I've had some painful experiences in that world. I do not want to have access to things that I really shouldn't have. That includes production resources like that. So in those cases, you really should be using something like a secrets manager. This is, something like HashiCorp Vault. AWS has a secrets manager. There's a Google Cloud Key Management Service. There's all kinds of stuff that you can do. So you don't know what you don't know, meaning that sometimes you feel the pain before you realize this is an issue. Prevent that and go ahead and make sure that you're dealing with your config appropriately. Okay, number 4, backing services. This is a good this. A backing service is really any service that the app needs as part of its normal operation. That includes databases, that includes any messaging systems like RabbitMQ, that includes, maybe services for mail, SMTP services, maybe caching systems, things like that. These really, and from the 12-factor app, the code should make no distinction between local and third-party services. So any of these resources should be considered just attached resources. They can be accessed via a URL or credentials that are located in the configuration. You should be able, the goal here is to be able to swap any of those things out without having to rebuild the app. And in this case, that makes sense for a container. We don't want to have to rebuild an image and launch a container just to be able to swap out something like this. All right, number 5, build, release, run. Strictly separate build and run stages. Now, just for fun, I put a YouTube link here. That's to a video of how bananas are actually sent through a processing plant. I learned more about how bananas are processed than I ever needed to know, but I thought it would be fun to include. This picture is also of a banana processing plant. I mean, if you can imagine, they need to be grown, they need to be harvested, they need to be washed, and then they need to be shipped everywhere. So yeah, it's all very interesting. Our software needs to have different stages like this too, from development in the beginning all the way to actual deployment. And the most important stages are the 3 that are defined in the 12-factor app. That's the build stage, the release stage, and the run stage. Every release should have a unique ID. In Java, this was for our jars, it was, we always had like a timestamp attached to the end. Or you can have, some increasing version number. These are, the tags for images are often set up this way. Releases cannot be changed after they've been created. So once you've developed and you've built, that build should be immutable. Other than, environment specific things that are run by, config that we talked about, you should never be rebuilding your artifact when you move between different environments or when you go to release. And then, of course, when you go to run your application. So that's the rule here. For your images, same thing. You should never be rebuilding your images. It should be built in the beginning. This, may be triggered by a commit to a repo. Developer makes some changes, makes a commit. This goes through the build process. The build goes through and assigns a version number to that particular artifact. Now that artifact is ready to be promoted through the rest of the lifecycle until it potentially actually gets released to production. Number 6, processes. 12-factor processes are stateless and share nothing. Any data that needs to persist must be stored in a stateful backing service, typically a database. That's a quote from the 12-factor app. One thing that they do here is they call out sticky sessions specifically. And I had to laugh because I do remember an application I worked on a long time ago where it wasn't a containerized application initially, but we were working toward that end. And we didn't deal with this problem until much later. But we already had it up in containers and we absolutely did use sticky sessions for a while. So this is definitely something that needs to be fixed. Your apps should not have state within them. For the simple reason is because they're ephemeral. Containers are ephemeral. They can leave at any time. They can be shut down at any time. So if you really need to rely or use session state data or anything like that, you need to bring in something like Memcached or Redis, something that is more appropriate to handle that type of data. Certainly don't be handling it with your container. Number 7, port binding. This is pretty simple to me. I mean, it's one of the first things I learned when building my first containers. And being able to assign a port and then just being able to access it directly on my local machine was pretty awesome. I know an app that I containerized, it previously involved injecting a web server into the execution environment. And in this case, now that we have containers, we actually, use a dependency to add the web server library to the app itself. So we have it available to us. It's not something that happens later. This was really nice for me because I do remember being in a situation where I was working on an application that was delivered to a client who then set it up and used it. So just to clarify, I was working on a Java app and I delivered to them the Java app, the Java web app. And then they would do all of this stuff, to get it up and running and get the web server set up and stuff like that. We, at that time, did not have very good communication about what web server they were using, what version they were using, all kinds of stuff. So in our own internal testing, we discovered some pretty severe issues with that concerning certain versions of Tomcat. And some things just did not work quite right. So that was something that we had to go through painfully. So this is much nicer to have a dependency like that to be included with the application. Number 8, concurrency. In the 12-factor app, processes are a first-class citizen. This is nice. For containers especially, this allows us to scale out horizontally much easier. And a good example of doing this too, and being able to handle work like this is using the good old pub/sub architecture. So you have, you consume requests, you might put those requests on a queue. Maybe that's handled, by a broker of some kind. You can then collect, maybe you have workers that get spun up and they collect work from that queue, and you're able to scale better that way. So this fits right into how we deal with containers and how we, logically divide services to make sure that we can scale appropriately. Number 9, disposability. The 12-factor apps processes are disposable, meaning they can be started or stopped at a moment's notice. This goes right along with, a good reason why you don't handle state in your containers. You need to be able to do this, you need to be able to scale, but not only just scale up, but scale down. This means, you're able to take advantage of some cost savings and resource savings when your load isn't as high. So now we have, automatic scaling capabilities that frameworks like Kubernetes offer us. And we need to be able to shut down these services gracefully, meaning they really need to respond to a SIG-term signal. So this is something that you need to make sure works with your container before releasing. And then, in order to be able to scale up, you need to be able to minimize your startup time as well. Also, make sure that you implement, liveliness and readiness probes so that you can, your internal systems can be more aware whether or not a container is actually ready to start receiving requests, things like that. And most of us are not going to be perfect with this right out of the gate. I know my team several years ago wasn't. We had containers that were continuously restarting. And unfortunately, we did not have the best communication with our operations team at the time. So their solution was just, oh, well, if it crashes, just restart it. Well, the result of that, since I already confessed to you that we were handling some state, the result of that was that we would often lose, parts of jobs, things like that would go on. So if you make sure that you have that communication, monitor when your services are going down and make sure that you understand why. Is it a scaling action or is there actually a bug in your system that you need to consider getting fixed quickly? So make sure, any behavior like that is noted and communicated to your devs in the right way. All right, number 10, dev prod parity. Keep development staging and production as similar as possible. I had already told you my story about how we were developing an app and delivering it, and they were using completely different tools to deploy than what we were internally. That is just, sets you up for some problems that you could avoid. It would be wonderful to be able to tell, your client, if you use this particular version, be watchful for such and such, be prepared for such and such. Being able to keep all of these environments as similar as possible is a very good idea. And containers fit right in here too. They allow us to be able to run, pretty much the same application in development as in staging, as in production. The tempting thing here is to use different backing services. So that's something to be aware of as well. Not a good idea to use a different database or a different broker. There's all kinds of things that you don't anticipate when you start switching those kinds of things around, and always good to catch problems earlier rather than in production when everything is different. So good idea to keep all these the same. Obviously, this fits right into containers. It keeps all of our, everything around the container and the app the same. Pretty nice. Logs. It has been years since I've had to configure logs. So when I took a look at this one, I have a lot of unanswered questions here. So there's a lot of experimentation I want to do. I remember being in a situation where we had some containers running. We had logs, but we were doing stupid things like, our application inside the container was logging to a file. Well, that file lives inside the container. It wasn't, mounted anywhere. It wasn't like an external file or anything. So, you can predict what happens there. Anytime that container dies, those logs are gone. So a 12-factor app, not even just a container, but any 12-factor app, you need to make sure that you're handling logs appropriately. The app itself should not be concerned with writing or managing log files. It's one of the stipulations of the principle. Each should write to the event stream to standard out. And if you want to handle those logs in some way, if you want to ship those logs somewhere, that's up to you to do that. You might want to use something external to do that. You can use, log routers like Fluentd, huge, good idea for that. You can also, take all of these logs, send them out to something like Splunk so that you can start doing some analysis, things like that. But just, be aware, by default, Docker, it will log to standard out and standard error. But if you've got applications inside the container doing their own thing, make sure that you are aware of that. Oh, another thing that happened to us, and obviously we figured this out before it went to production, but a lot of those logs there was a lot of logs. And when you have a little container and you might deploy several containers on a single VM, you're going to quickly run out of space. So we learned quickly that we need to make sure that our logs don't live within the container. And the last one here, admin processes. Run admin management tasks as one-off processes. The examples of these are running database migrations or running a console to kind of, maybe inspect the app with real data, for example, or any other one-time scripts that you might need to run occasionally. All of these things need to be included with the app. So those one-time scripts need to be committed into the repo, just like everything else. When you run any of these processes, they should be with the same environment, the same dependencies, everything else around it should be the same as the app itself. So with containers, this is nice because you can actually just maybe spin up another container and then be able to do these one-off processes. That way, you have the same release, you've got scripts that are compatible. This is, a good idea with containers. Kubernetes has operators. This is another way that you might be able to do stuff like repair tasks or maybe database schema setup, things like that. You might be able to use, other frameworks to help with this. So that's it. This overview of 12 factors, is this good? Are they applicable to containers? I think absolutely. It seems like it fits very well with containerization, a lot of the same goals and outcomes. So yeah, thanks very much. If you have any Docker files lying around, I guess your task now is to go and walk through them and see if your images in your containers are actually following these guidelines. And what I would love to hear from you is if you find any reasons or exceptions to the rule, why you would not follow a principle the way it's stated in your application, how you have it built and packaged.
Thank you very much. So due to time, I'm going to allow for one pressing question from Melissa. Melissa, can you hear us okay?
Yes.
Okay, great. One question. Anybody have one question that you can't go to sleep tonight unless you get the answer? Okay. Well, I know Melissa's exceptionally. Oh, you got one?
I have a question. I know I can't go to sleep.
Okay. All right. Let's not go to extremes. Go ahead. One question.
Yeah. So regarding the factor about a singular code base, there is a concept of mono repos. Not to be confused with monoliths, right? And there are pros and cons and trade-offs to having a mono repo versus having like multiple repos. I think of CI/CD and having like pipelines that are reusable across multiple applications or services. I'm curious what your thoughts are there in terms of like violating that rule for like a mono repo.
I get into this argument frequently about mono repos. I don't like them, but I mean, it's mainly for personal reasons, but there's some reasons I don't like them is, for one, when you have a code base set up like that, it kind of implies one of the big advantages is if it's all written in the same language. Yeah, that's great. That way you can bring it all in. You can bring it all into your IDE. If you make a change somewhere, you can address, any complications or considerations, anywhere else in that huge code base. But I feel like if you're already there doing that, maybe they're not logically separated enough anyway. I mean, if you have enough code that's being shared between those services, maybe there's some other issues in the structure that need to be dealt with. If they can't be cleanly separated out into another repo, there might be some other things to worry about. Ideally, I would like to be able to see like different teams be able to handle different components and have their own release cycle, their own pipelines that they're concerned with. Maybe they can reuse templates of pipelines, but maybe their release cycle is different than other components in the system. Also, every time you check that code base out, I don't know, you just got to hack away at it to figure out how to only pull in what you need and not build the entire thing every time, right? And then also tracking your releases, making sure that, if every commit actually triggers a build, does that mean that everything needs to be re-released or just the code that was changed in the component that was changed? So yeah, lots of issues to think about.
Thank you so much, Melissa. Really appreciate it.